All right, sorry about that. We had a bit of technical difficulty. So today we're presenting on, I was trying to show you, but it's, well, you know the topic. So today we're presenting on, is the Bible hateful for women? Now, the main book that we're focusing on today is from Copeland, is God a Moral Monster? There are a few chapters that basically tackle all the major issues and objections people have against God and put them and bring answers towards them in a systematic way. I invite you guys to take up the book and take a read for yourself. It addresses other controversial issues like, is God an ethnic cleanser, slavery in the Bible, women in the Bible, and other controversial topics are my views of God. It basically takes those views and challenges them and bring our corresponding or coherent answer to face these objections against God and the Bible. So in this chapter, we'll be having a discussion on it, so you can tell me what you think, if you have any objections or anything like that. What you think about when you speak about misogyny and the Bible. That's by Paul Copeland. I'll send you. There's chapter 10 in the textbook.
Chapter 11, Bride Price, Polygamy, Concubinage, and other such questions. Since the time of Thomas Jefferson, Chapter 11, Bride Price, Polygamy, Concubinage, Chapter 10, Misogynistic, and other critics often resort
Sorry, can everybody hear the book? Or
misrepresentations of the Old Testament laws. While Mosaic laws do not always reflect the ultimate or the ideal, which the Old Testament itself acknowledges.
Can everybody hear?
Verse 23. What then is Ezekiel talking about? The text clearly indicates that God gave the Sinai generation statutes, chukot, for example, Sabbath commands, by which an Israelite might live, chapter 20, verses 12 through 13. Israel rejected these laws at Sinai. They used to follow them. Chapter 9, barbarisms, crude laws, and other imaginary crimes.
All right, so I'm going to try this a different way. Sorry about that.
All right, everyone. So as we sort out the technical difficulties, I want to hear from you. What are some of the arguments that you've heard or objections from either side, either way, regarding the statement or our topic today, that the Bible is hateful against women? What are some examples that you've probably heard persons say? Anybody? All right, so one that I have heard, for example, is the people bringing up about the woman caught in the act of adultery. And I don't know why I'm seeing a green around Claudine's Claudine, are you trying to speak or? Because you're muted. Okay, either way, let me just continue until we sort that out if you're speaking. All right, so we know the story of when the Pharisees actually came to Jesus with dragging along this woman who was caught in the act of adultery, and then they were saying that the law says that she must be put to death because she was caught in the very act of adultery, right? So you have some critics of the Bible that was saying that this shows that the law was hateful against women because it was a woman that they brought to Jesus. So what do we say about that? What would you say about in objection to that? Is that a legitimate example of misogyny in the Bible? Why or why not?
I don't think the Bible specifically stated that. I think it just said adultery in general, like whether if it was because if it was a man that was adultering, it should apply either way. So I think they're just saying that out of convenience because it applies to both men and.
Exactly. Thanks for that, Rajni. So that's exactly so. So if you actually read the text, the Pharisees were being very hypocritical. The law of Moses actually has that the man and the woman should be put to death. But because they wanted, their motive was to trap Jesus, they just went and brought this woman. So it's not that the law actually only says the woman should be put to death and the man will be left unharmed. I'm gonna be trying to, because I want to give you this precise text. So if anything, because I think Marcel has gotten the clip up, but I'll be looking for the text and then I will either put it in the inbox or announce it quickly or let Marcel announce it for those who are on YouTube, maybe or Facebook looking on. But one principle I just wanted to share is that when you look at the context, I would just, I would just encourage that whatever objection that comes to you, look at the context, look at if there was a motive in terms of the person who is actually saying that or using that example, because usually when you actually look in depth, the arguments actually disintegrate, right? So it's either taken out of context or something, right? So that's what I will share now. I think Marcel is ready. Are you?
Yes. Please let me know if you can hear. If not, it's been a bit difficult for me today, but I'm gonna start playing.
Chapter 10, Misogynistic, Women in Israel. When we start talking about the treatment of women in the Old Testament, the pandemonium begins. Feminists accuse Old Testament writers of endorsing.
So you guys were able to hear that. TV done.
All right, so I did hear, but just a quick announcement. Leviticus 20 verse 10 is the text, and it says that if a man commits adultery with another man's wife or with his neighbor's wife, both he and the woman must be put to death for their adultery, right? So it is very specific that it's not just the woman that is targeted for these sins, right?
Okay, all right. So thank you, Sarah, for this resume since everyone is here.
All kinds of sexism, patriarchy, socially oppressive structures favoring men over women, and even misogyny, hatred of women. Misogynistic is one of the adjectives Richard Dawkins uses to describe the Old Testament God. Why does Sarah refer to her husband as my master? Genesis chapter 18, verse 12, NIV. Why do Hebrew girls belong to their father's house? For example, Leviticus chapter 22, verse 13. Why does an Israelite woman remain ceremonially unclean for 40 days after giving birth to a boy, but 80 days after having a girl? Leviticus chapter 12, verses 12 through 5. Why can't women participate in the priesthood of Israel? What about all those concubines? What about levirate marriage? Why does God permit polygamy? Doesn't the Old Testament endorse a bride price, which only reinforces the idea of women as property? In this chapter, we'll look at the underlying male-female equality in the Old Testament and some passages that allegedly suggest otherwise. Then, in the next chapter, we'll review some key passages related to polygamy, multiple wives, and concubines, as well as related passages that critics commonly mention. Genesis chapters 1 and 2, the original ideal. However we understand the Levitical laws and Old Testament narratives regarding women, Genesis chapters 1 and 2 points us to the ideal view of women, which is far from a fallen, skewed, or demeaning attitude. God creates male and female in his image, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Eve is taken from Adam's rib, Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, a picture of equality and partnership, not one of a superior to an inferior. Marriage is to be a partnership of equals, and sex, the one-flesh union, is to be enjoyed within the safety of lifelong heterosexual marriage. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Although Genesis chapters 1 and 2 spells out the ideal of male-female equality, laws regarding women in Israel take a realistic approach to fallen human structures in the ancient Near East. In Israel's legislation, God does two things. One, he works within a patriarchal society to point Israel to a better path. And two, he provides many protections and controls against abuses directed at females in admittedly substandard conditions. Do we see examples of oppressed women in the Old Testament? Yes, and we see lots of oppressed men as well. In other words, we shouldn't consider these negative examples endorsements of oppression and abuse. The equality of women from various angles. Reading the Old Testament reveals two important parallel features. One, patriarchal social structures in Israelite families, alongside, two, the honoring of women as equals, including a bevy of prominent matriarchs and female leaders in Israel. On the one hand, fathers had legal responsibility for their households, often reaching 15 to 20 members. This included matters of family inheritance, property ownership, marital arrangements of sons and daughters, and being spokesman for family matters in general. For instance, when a daughter or a wife took a vow, such solemn promises were to be approved by the father or husband as the legal point person in the home. Numbers chapter 30. This represents more than just legal protection for a wife or a daughter, though. Embedded social attitudes and ideas die hard, especially in places like the ancient Near East. Patriarchal attitudes were strongly held in the ancient Near East, attitudes that were a far cry from the equality language at creation. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 affirms that a man was to leave his parents and cling to his wife as an equal partner, NRSV. But the fall deeply affected human relationships. As a result, Sarah followed the ancient Near Eastern custom of calling her husband Lord, Adon, Genesis chapter 18, verse 12. She gave her handmaid Hagar to Abraham to produce a child, Genesis chapter 16, verse 3, a common ancient Near Eastern practice. Later, King Abimelech took Sarah as his wife, Genesis chapter 20, verses 2 and 3. And when Sarah gave birth to Isaac, she bore a son to Abraham, Genesis chapter 21, verses 2 and 3. On the other hand, these embedded patriarchal attitudes distorted the many strong biblical affirmations of female dignity and equality. Mothers, wives deserved honor equal to that of husbands, fathers, and strong matriarchs both helped lead Israel and had sway within their households. Yes, the husband was the legal point person for the Israelite family, but we shouldn't automatically assume that women considered this an oppressive arrangement. In fact, wives in many Old Testament marriages were, for all practical purposes, equal and equally influential in their marriages and beyond. For example, Proverbs chapter 31. In fact, many passages speak more of protection and care for those who are often taken advantage of, especially widows or divorced women. God is concerned about justice for widows and the other vulnerables of society, such as orphans and non-Israelite strangers or aliens. God sternly warned would-be oppressors that he's on the side of the weak and defenseless. Exodus chapter 22, verse 22, Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 18, chapter 14, verse 29, chapter 24, verses 17 and 19, etc. Now, feminists would dispute the claim that Israelite women wives were considered equal in personhood and dignity to men husbands. Let's address this point. Yes, patriarchal structures strongly influence the mindset of Israelite society. Yet we see undeniable affirmations of equality in the Old Testament from theological, historical, and legal perspectives. Theological. Female equality is presumed in the following passages. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Compare chapter 21, verse 15, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 16, chapter 21, verses 18 through 21, chapter 27, verse 16. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3, every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father. Compare chapter 20, verse 9. Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20, my son, observe the commandment of your father, and do not forsake the teaching of your mother. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 22, he who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord. Proverbs chapter 19, verse 26, he who assaults his father and drives his mother away is a shameful and disgraceful son. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 22, listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Proverbs chapter 23, verse 25. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her rejoice who gave birth to you. Song of Songs chapter 6, verse 3. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. Compare chapter 7, verse 10. When it comes to Genesis chapter 2, verse 18, where Adam's wife is called a suitable helper, Azer, we should recall that rather than suggesting inferiority, the same word is used of God elsewhere in Scripture. Psalms 10, verse 14, 30, verse 10, 54, verse 4. We could list more passages on these theological aspects, but you get the idea. Historical. The Old Testament is full of powerful matriarchs who were highly valued and exerted a great deal of influence. The testimony of the Old Testament authors reveals a perspective that can hardly be called misogynistic. Consider the following list for starters. Sarah, Hagar, Rebekah, Rachel, Leah, and Tamar, all in Genesis. The Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah, Exodus chapter 1. The Egyptian princess, Exodus chapter 2. Miriam and Jethro's 7 daughters, including Zipporah, Moses' wife, Exodus chapters 2, 4, 15. The daughters of Zelophehad, Numbers chapter 27, Deborah, Ruth, Naomi, Abigail, and Bathsheba, Judges chapters 4 and 5, Ruth chapters 1 through 4, 1 Samuel chapter 25, 1 Kings chapters 1 and 2. And let's not forget that excellent Proverbs chapter 31 woman. These strong women stepped forward and wielded influence with the best of the men. Legal. The moral and ceremonial laws of Israel presumed that women were not only equal, but also shared equal moral responsibility with the men. One author writes that the system of Israel's ritual and purity laws is rather even-handed in its treatment of gender. Some might quibble with the ceremonial uncleanness of menstruation, which obviously affects women and not men. But as we'll see, men have their own issues. And the purity laws also address these. For instance, Leviticus chapter 15, verses 16 through 18, 32, chapter 22, verse 4, Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 10. The moral, not just ceremonial, aspects of the Levitical laws that address incest and adultery, for example, Leviticus chapters 18 and 20, apply to men and women without distinction. In fact, those claiming that committing adultery against one's neighbor's wife was a property offense in Israel are incorrect. Both the man and the woman can be put to death for adultery, but unlike the Code of Hammurabi, Old Testament law never requires the death penalty for property offenses. Texts that allegedly...
Sorry, just to interject. Do you guys, what you guys are, how do you feel about what's being said so far? Do you have any objections, questions, queries, concerns? Feel free to open your mic and speak now. I guess everyone is okay. All right, so I guess wait, sorry, can you guys hear Sarah in the audience? Can you hear her? No. Okay, but what I particularly like about what's going been said so far, that in comparison, even back then, when you're treated harsh, I don't argue with it, just throw them in a tar to prove their innocence. Even then, the Bible and God, at a higher level, you have to bring witnesses to prove it. You don't just assume guilt and just throw them in some tar pit or some crazy practices that was just going beyond back in the day. No, the Bible set up protections for women, but these things are not highlighted, I think, daily, and that is the problem we're having with the Bible, and where they will say that the Bible is misogynistic, or the Bible hates women, or the Bible have to oppress women. Compared to the societal standards, they were still far ahead. They used to treat women hard back then with no evidence. You can just accuse a woman. But we'll be listening to see what we talk. Hopefully you hear those chapters come out as you go through the different verses in the Bible that defended women and brought women up to a higher standard. The protection of women to a higher standard versus what cultural norms were.
promote female inferiority. Now it's time to look at some of those potentially embarrassing passages that put down women. The trial of jealousy, Numbers chapter 5. Let's summarize the theme of this text. If a man suspected his wife of adultery, he could bring her before the priest to accuse her. In this case, 2 or 3 witnesses weren't available, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 6 and 7. The only witness was the husband's suspicion that his wife had been cheating on him. Critics charge that this would have been a terrifying ordeal. A cheating wife's abdomen would swell and her thigh would shrivel after drinking the water of bitterness. Critics raise the question, why couldn't a woman bring her husband before the priest if she suspected that he was guilty of adultery? As it turns out, critics have chosen a poor text to illustrate oppression of women. For one thing, consider the context. which gives us every reason to think that this law applied to men as well. Before and after this passage, the legislation concerns both men and women, Israelites, Numbers chapter 5, verse 2, NIV, a man or woman, Numbers chapter 6, verse 2. It wasn't just the husband's prerogative to call for this special trial, the wife could as well. Second, this priestly court was actually arranged for the protection and defense of women, not to humiliate them before proud husbands or prejudiced mobs. This law protected women from a husband's violent rage or arbitrary threat of divorce to get rid of his wife cheaply. And if the woman happened to be guilty, then she'd rightly be terrified by a supernatural sign affecting her body. In fact, as with the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira in the early church, Acts chapter 5, the Israelites would have a sobering warning regarding God's attitude toward adultery. Some critics have compared this event to the river ordeal practiced in non-Israelite ancient Near Eastern cultures, Babylon, Assyria, Sumer. How did this work? When criminal evidence was inconclusive, the accused would be thrown into a bitumen well, that is, a natural petroleum tar commonly used as a sealant and adhesive and as a mortar for bricks. In Sumer, this tar river was the abode of the god Id, which means river. Sometimes these jumpers and plungers who went into the god were overcome by the liquid and its toxic fumes. Most survived, they were spat out by the river god, but it was still a nightmare to endure. If one was overcome by the river, he was guilty, since his death was the river god's judgment. If he survived, he was innocent, and the accuser was guilty of making false charges. There's a big difference between this ordeal and Numbers chapter 5, though. The river ordeal was the general treatment for inconclusive criminal evidence across the board. In the Mosaic Law, however, a charge couldn't be established unless 2 or 3 witnesses were available. Otherwise, the prosecuting side didn't have a case. End of story. In the unique trial of jealousy in Numbers 5, though witnesses weren't available, it's understandable that certain clues might tip off a husband or a wife to something fishy going on with a spouse. Strange behavior, irrational reactions, breaking out into sudden sweats, or simply the husband's belief that he wasn't involved in his wife's conception of a child. Second, if the accused couldn't swim and get out of the tar, he looked guilty, even if he were innocent. Not so if an Israelite wife or husband was falsely accused. A telltale supernatural sign was provided to prove guilt. Third, the river ordeal assumed guilt until innocence was proven. In the trial of jealousy, the court assumed innocence unless guilt was exposed by a divinely given miracle. Impurity at childbirth, Leviticus chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. This passage, some claim, implies female inferiority. The woman is ceremonially impure for 40 days, 7 plus 33 days, after giving birth to a boy, but 80 days, 14 plus 66 days, after giving birth to a girl. Surely this reveals a lower social status for females. Again, not so fast. Various sensible explanations have been proposed. Some scholars argue that more days for the female actually indicate a kind of protection of females rather than a sign of inferiority. Others suggest the motive may be to preserve Israel's religious distinctiveness over against Canaanite religion, in which females engaged in religious sexual rites in their temples. In general, a Jewish mother's lengthier separation from the tabernacle, or temple, after giving birth to a girl made a theological and ethical statement. In ancient Near Eastern polytheism, the strong emphasis was on fertility rites, cult prostitution, and the dramatization of the births of gods and goddesses. The distance between the birth event and temple worship, especially with baby girls, was carefully maintained. Another plausible explanation focuses on a natural source of uncleanness, namely the flow of blood. Verse 5 refers to the reason, it's because of the blood of her purification. The mother experiences vaginal bleeding at birth. Yet such vaginal bleeding is common in newborn girls as well, due to the withdrawal of the mother's estrogen when the infant girl exits the mother's womb. So we have two sources of ritual uncleanness with the girl's birth, but only one with the boy's. Notice also that when the time of purification is over, whether for a son or for a daughter, the mother is to bring the identical offering, whether a lamb, pigeon, or turtle dove. This is to be a purification offering, chapter 12, verse 6, not technically a sin offering, and its purpose is to take away the ritual, not moral impurity. Levirate marriage, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. If a man died without a son to carry on the family name, then his unmarried brother could marry his widow in order to sustain the family name. Legally, the firstborn son from this union was officially the deceased husband's son. Since the first husband was deceased, this wasn't considered incest, sexual relations with an in-law. The term levirate comes from the Latin word for a husband's brother or brother-in-law, levir. This legislation sounds quite strange to modern ears, and it certainly does reflect a patriarchal background. A similar practice was carried out by the Hittites. Their law stated that if a man has a wife and then dies, his brother must take the widow as his wife. While levirate marriage was an admittedly patriarchal arrangement, we should keep certain things in mind. First, if the widow did marry her deceased husband's brother, this would help keep the widow's property, which she may have brought to the marriage, within the family. Marrying outside the family meant running the risk of losing it. Second, although the man could refuse, this was discouraged. And if he refused to comply, the widow herself could exert her role and her rights in the shaming sandal ceremony. So the widow had a certain natural advantage in this arrangement. It's instructive to place this levirate scenario next to the story of Zelophehad's daughters, Numbers chapter 27, verses 1 through 11. In the ancient Near East, there existed patriarchal laws of primogeniture, the firstborn's right to receive property and inherit family headship from the father. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 17 reveals that this meant a double portion for the firstborn over his brothers. Yet primogeniture is subtly overturned at various points in the Old Testament. Though Mosaic legislation operated within patriarchal structures of the ancient Near East, the Old Testament reveals a certain dynamism and openness to change. The daughters of the deceased, sonless Zelophehad appealed to Moses regarding the male-favoring inheritance laws. In light of the women's particular circumstances, Moses took this matter before God, and the daughters' appeal was granted. When humans sought to change social structures in light of a deeper moral insight and a determination to move toward the ideal, we witness an adaptation of ancient Near Eastern structures. Even earlier in the Old Testament, various narratives subtly attack the primogeniture arrangement. The younger regularly supersedes the elder. Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph Judah over Reuben. This biblical sampling reveals a subversive and more democratic ethic. Though not ideal, it's a drastic improvement over other ancient Near Eastern laws. Your neighbor's wife, Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. You shall not covet is the 10th commandment. It prohibits longing for what rightfully belongs to another. What's included in this prohibition? A neighbor's house, wife, male or female servant, ox, donkey, and anything that belongs to your neighbor. Critics complain that a wife is unflatteringly and inappropriately viewed as property, in the same category as a neighbor's house, ox, or donkey. One big problem. Just a few commands earlier, Exodus chapter 20, verse 12, children are commanded to give their mother honor equal to that of the father. A mother was to have equal authority over her children. Check out the string of verses cited earlier in this chapter. Another big problem, women in Israel weren't saleable items like houses, oxen, or donkeys. A further revealing fact is that in other cultures in the ancient Near East, the mother was often under the control of the son. Yet the Mosaic law presents a striking contrast in this regard. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 3 commands the son to revere mother and father alike. And the mother is even listed first. No female priests? Why
All right, so there's another show. I was just like, this for discussion. What you think you've heard? Think about what you've heard so far. Any objections, concerns, criticisms, or anything you like anything that has been now highlighted to you that you weren't aware of before? I open it first to TV land. I guess TV land has nothing to say. Oh, all right. What I like really with the last part, I think, was the fact that they constantly do the comparison to all outside of Israel, where the son was faced in control over the man that last said. That to me was a new perspective that was not often taught about how society was really dealing with women at that time. We always want to criticize the Bible, I guess because the Bible has been around for so long. But if you recognize how much worse was outside, the Bible actually took out steps to try and protect women as best as it could, even within the same patriarchal amount that was existing at the time. So I thought that was very interesting. The fact that even in some scriptures they point out the women first before the man. You don't hear those things often spoken about when in churches or anywhere else. Gives you the false narrative there, helps perpetuate the false narrative, I believe, that women are first and women are so somehow so subhuman to look at our man. It's not the truth. If you're listening to what the pastor is saying, start to even the various passages that they listed before. But anything else from anyone else, or we just continue to the last portion of this chapter about female priests, which is one of the common objections that they have of why we don't have priests in the Bible. Right. Wait, see, hold on. So I didn't hear that last part. You said it was inspired by God. I didn't hear that part. Right, 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 It doesn't. You have to provide some examples and you have to go into the context in which you say. Oh, okay. No, this is not my interpretation. This is a person giving you a person. Okay, right. Okay, okay, right, right. Just straightforward as you want. So far. That's okay. We're here to have a discussion. But that judgment. Bias towards me. All right. Before I get to I just want to give up responses if that's okay. Again, it's okay to have some but there are several parts in the Bible where God spoke about, for example, if you find a wife, you find a good thing, right? He describes how a wife should be. Notice that he doesn't say those who find a husband find a good thing. So there's something that's specifically unique to a wife. Those just one instance. There's another instance where the Bible speaks about when God talks about how a wife treats, a husband treats his wife. I said, husband treat your wife in such and such a way. If not, I will cut you off. I will ignore your prayers. It's in first, so I don't remember where it is. Notice that he gave, all he just said to the wife that you must submit to your husband, but there is no consequence to the wife if she does not submit to her husband. But there's consequences to the husband if he does treat his wife as a partner. No? You don't agree with me? Why not? Okay. So here, so the new okay, I see. Right. That's not true. That, that was actually addressed. That was actually that's not true. That was actually addressed. Right, I'm taking it away. No, No, I'm saying that there's, hold on, hold on. No, no. There are scriptures in the Bible that carry the man. What do you mean in terms of that? I'm talking in, no, no, when I said treat little turned up, that's just general treatment. Oh, you belong to a different dimension. I did not say words, but just general how it treats. Well, that's like no, it's just so when I got parts, the bigger the look of so I get but the part of the context of that passage I would quote it, I don't need to do extra answer of it. It's just general treatment of course that's all. So when you say that it was right. No, but I'm saying that there are special protections for the female based on society will set up females, for example. Sorry. Oh, thank God. Allow me to say that. For example, if a woman, women at that time were expected to work, right? Would agree with that, right? No, they were expected to work. They weren't expected to work. Back in those days, they were expected to be breadwinners. Right, that is finished and here. Right, no, but I'm talking every time I bring up a point, bring up a discussion, I'm talking in general sense. Women were not because of how the system was set up, patriarchal system, the men were the breadwinners. Right, that's what I was trying to say. That the main purpose or the main breadwinner should be man's responsibility. And in an instance where the man fell apart or the man caught protections that were placed in the Bible. For example, where I think you probably missed that, where he said that the brother of the party married to protect the wife so she gets still something. People are people are placed in. There were protections made to protect women that there would be said there because of all those systems in society set up. That she won't be homeless or she won't be suffering and destitute. Things like that. And if you're in the scripture, you know, no, it was mentioned here earlier that he says, make sure you don't depart from the Bible. Don't disrespect Father, don't treat them as the distinction for one treats you treat God. That distinction was made very clear in some of the passages. Maybe I thought that you'd be interested in reading it for yourself. No, this. Right. Um, Yes. The view of the time, views of people, was hungry, angry, men were inspired.
Right. I can agree with that.
So it was not the people view. It was not.
So, I got my face. We got Anyway, right. So what we're seeing in the Bible is a mixture of a historical account in some areas, as well as you have the law section, you have the prophets. And so it's very important that we don't misinterpret that where you have an account of something that happens, like for example, the rape of Tamar, that people misinterpret that to say that God endorses what is recorded, because some parts of the Bible really do just account for what happened, and it tells what the consequences were and what people chose to do. And then you have so if you're going to critique about God's perspective, it's important to look at what part of the Bible, what is the intention, what literature is that the law. So where you mentioned the example of the woman having to bring the action or something. And then we also talked about that there was a point in the law where the adultery, both the man and the sex, Leviticus 20 verse 10. We were talking about that before. Both the man and the woman, if they're causing adultery, they should both be respected. So when you look at the law, you see equivalence, even though some persons will say that okay, this was mentioned for the woman, like for example, the Pharisees just brought the woman, but that doesn't say when you actually look at what the law says, we see that they were not actually putting it into practice. So we do have to, even though all the Bible is inspired by God, you have to bear in mind that it also has a historical component where it's just a narrative of what is done. Then you have a critique of how is the law applying in this context. So that's one point. Properly based on what is intended it to be. So I think that that is where we should really we can actually criticize in terms of the processes, not just the processes of what happened. Okay, the genealogies are there and that these are representatives, and not also extrapolate and assume that because of that, that says that God valued them more, right? Because that's not. I think you need more pieces to that puzzle to actually make that claim in a strong way to actually say that really implies that. Because for us, as Marcel said, headship, for example, for me as a woman, things that can be subduing me on my body. It's like a protection, and someone is needed to be a leader of any system. My head of department is not someone you need, it's not that teamwork more than you need partner. But you need a structure for the system to work properly for all parts, right? So we do have to have that type of dialogue. Is it reasonable for us to say that? And that's no, right? So we kind of look at the assumptions of what each argument says. Look at our own assumption of is it valid? Do we have substantive arguments? Very happy for you to check this. We actually think through further. How to approach that, and is it that I was missing something? Because also I think more than we have with or right, so all right, but those online, oh my, two, is this me and you alone online now? So but anyway, people are on YouTube and the Facebook, so you weren't finished, but we're kind of out of time.
Yeah. What we're having meeting wise. It tackles a lot of the objection and the counter argument from the Bible. That's why how you can not see that you don't need to correct it like that. I was giving you an opportunity to actually critique the document for yourself versus an audio version, because I thought that would be more palatable to see.
Yes.
No, stations.
Yes, we,
Yeah, wasn't there some story about I think there was some old lady that was crippled in some way where like her back was like bent or something like that, and like Jesus healed her. And I think some people were saying that why Jesus healing people on the Sabbath, and there was some argument about that. So would that also be used as a thing to say that women are being treated unfairly? Or is that like a non-argument? Maybe the argument about Sabbath in general, not really about yeah, that's another one as well. About leaving some in the field for the very poor people. But yeah, I have another thing here. The same book I was talking about. I was typing up some of the notes on my laptop this morning, and it was somewhere around Ephesians 5. I'm not sure if the podcast made any mention of it. And I think because the author in that book was talking about that being used as one of the arguments for for patriarchy in in a couple, because it says here in what is it? Ephesians 5 verse 22. Why submit yourself unto your husbands as unto the Lord. But if you look at the verses before and after, you see like it's almost like counteracting each other, because where is it? Yeah, because the verse before says submit yourself one to another in the fear of the Lord. So it seems like almost like a mutual submission type of thing.
Right. Because and look at the fact that God described the church and described it as a bride that should be protected. Why didn't he not describe him as a man? Describe him as a bride because of how he views women in mind. I'm just how he views women and how women should be protected above anything else. Always care for them and look up.
So I think one of the things though is because in the churches we don't hit don't please don't demonstrate that anyway. Don't play the role of women, but also I think the use of the word headship, like defining it, I think there is a gap where persons just assume dominance as being the main feature of headship when the Bible actually speaks about servant leadership. So Jesus went and washed his disciples' feet. He is God, and he is the example that his posture of leadership is one of protection, as you said. And so basically, Jesus said, go and put others before yourself. So it's something that it's just, I think, more of how we do in practice that the church maybe probably needs to improve on in terms of how they present what headship is and also how families actually operate in practice.
And also, but also if you think about headship, when somebody try to take out the opportunity, you aim for the head. So when you be in the head of an operation, you're not an additional target was on your back. So you have to fight all outside to protect what is inside as well. So that's why we can also see like to your point talking about what headship really means. It doesn't mean just dominance, power, and control. It means also target. And this additional pressure because it words like an active word is shifting the same parts it's a very pressuring role to be in and some people don't want that. Be protected from having that position sometimes is beneficial. You can just go about your daily life. I know some women will say yes, you want a position, but some actually want that protection.
Yeah, James 3 says that not many people should be leaders because they will be judged more strictly. So you do have a lot of responsibility, and that does not preclude women from leadership positions. So that's actually outside of the point in terms of what we're talking about. If we're talking about headship, it's like the household. But we also see even in the New Testament examples of women leaders in their home. We see Timothy's mother and grandmother, Lois and Eunice. They were the ones that were said to actually have led Timothy into the faith. He wasn't talking about his father, who was a Greek. So that does not preclude that we would have very dominant roles in faith, transmissions.
Then obviously I need somebody else.
Right.
But going towards Martha, going towards Martha is sometimes I say where it is look at Ephesians 5, for the husband to the wife, even as Christ is the leader of the church. So Christ is the leader of the church, not really nobody without the one but leading the church and whatever there's leading by example. So even with the example that spoken gave, because God said, washing our hands. He was showing the example that said, do this, treat people with love, and even going further, just the husband example towards what we do this where the Father is to the Church of Christ as individual. 27 and 28 shows us where, 28 and 29, where it shows us so men, so are men to love their wives as their own bodies, he that loves his wife, etc. For no man over his faithful son of marriage, even as the Lord of. So we can't be outside looking in, we can't be finding mistake for God gives us a mistake, God gives us a mistake. When we have verses like this, encouragement, even within the household, there's a person man that they will say, oh, this is God, you know, spoil us. And then just they're actually leading us. Example, what's the best way to go? And as I said, ambition. We have to making sure that as the man is the person that we be close, she's one that we be.
Homes are made by the wisdom of the rest by the nations. Proverbs 14, verse 1. All right, so are you going to, you're gonna?
So guys, thank you for coming up today. Unfortunately, we get into it, but I think we had a very productive discussion, I think. Support, and I really enjoyed it. I hope you guys benefited from the interaction as well. I will put the link in the list of the book. If you want to read more, it also talks about controversial topics like slavery in the Bible, like for polygamy and among other topics. To really tackle various challenges that they have against God and the Bible. All right, so thank you for this. Thank you for coming up this week, and we look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you as well. So just an announcement, we are going to be wrapping up this semester. So next week, I think we're going to be doing a movie. And so we'll also have food.
Probably the argument this year.
Something with some type of video or just another good interaction. So thank you for joining us, those online and also here. So have a good rest of your day.